I remember the moment I handed over the keys to my son's brand new $80,000 car, the gleaming black SUV I'd saved for years to buy. His eyes sparkled, but then he laughed and said to his friends, "Now I'm free." Those words pierced through me like a cold blade. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 6 years, I've lived alone in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The building is old, with thin walls that let in every sound from the street below. Sirens wailing at all hours, the rumble of delivery trucks before dawn, voices echoing from the bodega on the corner. My days blurred into one endless cycle of exhaustion and worry. Every morning, I'd wake to the sharp smell of burned coffee from the deli downstairs mixed with the stale scent of an old radiator that never quite warmed my small living room. The muffled city noises were a constant reminder of life moving around me, always moving, always leaving me behind. I'd shuffle through stacks of overdue bills scattered across my kitchen table, each envelope a weight on my chest, wondering if maybe today would be different. Maybe today, my son David would call just to say hello. Maybe today, he'd ask how I was feeling instead of what I could give him. But the only calls I ever received were requests. "Mom, I need money for rent." "Mom, can you cover my insurance this month?" "Mom, my girlfriend and I want to take a trip. Can you help us out?" Each conversation started the same way, with his voice tight and rushed, like he was checking items off a grocery list. My heart, my feelings, my own struggles. None of it ever made the list. The night before I gave him that car, I was sitting in my worn armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that reminded me of better times. Scrolling through my phone, hidden beneath years of forgotten messages, I found one from him that I'd somehow missed. "Can you loan me again? I'm broke and need cash fast." "No. Hello. No. How are you?" Just another demand dressed up as a request. I stared at that message for what felt like hours. The silence in my apartment was deafening, so different from the chaos of his childhood in our old brownstone in Brooklyn, when the house was filled with laughter and the sound of his friends running up and down the stairs. Back then, I'd find his tiny shoes lined up by the door, still dusty from playing in Prospect Park. I'd kept one of those pairs, tucked away in a shoebox in my closet, along with photos of his first bike leaning against our front stoop. When I decided to buy him that car, I expected something different. Maybe gratitude, maybe even love, maybe a embrace that lasted longer than his usual quick pat on the back. Instead, I got his declaration of freedom from me, it seemed. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, settling deep in my chest where it would stay for months to come. You see, all my life, I had put my family first. I need you to understand this, because it shapes everything that comes after. I worked double shifts at Mickey's Diner in Queens for 17 years, my feet swollen in cheap shoes, scrubbing grease off tables until past midnight so David could have what he needed. New sneakers for school, money for field trips, a decent winter coat when the other kids were wearing hand-me-downs. I gave up everything. Vacations became a foreign concept. I hadn't been to a movie theater in over a decade. When my teeth needed work, I postponed it years so I could cover David's college tuition. When he called to say he needed more money for books, I'd eat peanut butter sandwiches for weeks to stretch my budget. The physical pain in my back from standing on my feet all day, the stiffness in my hands from washing dishes. I endured it all silently, because I thought this was what love looked like. "Mom, I need more," he'd said during one of his rare visits to my apartment, his voice carrying that familiar tone of entitlement. Not a request, not even really a demand, just a statement of fact, like he was talking about the weather. I remember swallowing hard, the sting of manipulation clear as day, but I couldn't name it then. I just knew it hurt. Christmas 3 years ago, I decorated a small tree in my living room and cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way his grandmother used to make it. I waited by my phone all day, checking it every few minutes. Finally, at 8 in the evening, a text message. "With friends tonight. Have a good one." No call, no visit, No acknowledgement that I'd spent my entire Social Security check making sure he'd have gifts under his own tree. Another time, after I slipped on the icy steps outside my building and twisted my ankle, I called him for help. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. 2 hours later, while I was still sitting on those cold steps with my ankle throbbing, I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway above, his voice talking to someone about weekend plans. He'd been home the whole time, just letting my calls go to voicemail. When I finally made it upstairs with the help of my neighbor, I heard his apartment door close. He knew I'd fallen. He just didn't care enough to help. Those cold silences became louder than any words could ever be. I began to question everything I thought I knew about motherhood, about love, about the relationship I'd sacrificed everything to maintain. Was this love, or was I being used? Did my sacrifices mean anything to him? Or were they just fuel for his freedom while I remained trapped in this cycle of giving and receiving nothing in return? I started having dreams where I was drowning in receipts and bills while David stood on a shore, waving goodbye. I'd wake up gasping, the sheets soaked with sweat, wondering when exactly I'd stopped being his mother and started being his personal bank. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. How many times have you given everything you had to someone you loved, only to feel more empty afterward? How many times have you wondered if your love was being mistaken for weakness? The microaggressions built up like sediment over years. My 71st birthday passed without a single call from David. My 72nd birthday, the same. I spent both days alone in my apartment, watching reruns of old shows and pretending it didn't matter. "You're too emotional," he'd said the few times I tried to bring up how his absence made me feel. "It's just a birthday, Mom. People have real problems." When the doctor warned me about my blood pressure spiking to dangerous levels, I mentioned it to David during one of our rare phone conversations. "Mom, you're overreacting," he scoffed. "Just take your pills and stop worrying so much." He didn't ask what was causing my stress. He didn't offer to visit. He just dismissed my health concerns like I was bothering him with trivial complaints. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday afternoon in March, when I was going through old photos, trying to organize the memories I'd collected over decades. I pulled out a shoebox full of pictures from David's childhood, his first day of school, his high school graduation, family vacations from back when we could afford them. Tucked between the photos, I found receipts that made my blood run cold, credit card statements I'd never seen before, bills with my name on them that I didn't remember signing, loans taken out against my address that I'd never approved. My hands shook as I pieced together what I was looking at. David had been using my personal information to cover debts he'd never told me about. While I'd been struggling to pay my own bills, he'd been accumulating debts under my name, knowing I'd be too embarrassed or too afraid to confront him about it. The porcelain teacup I'd been holding slipped from my fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor, the sound echoing through my small apartment like a gunshot. I sat there surrounded by broken pieces of the cup, of my trust, of the relationship I'd thought we had. Quiet tears rolled down my cheeks as the weight of his betrayal settled into my bones. For the first time in years, a dangerous thought crossed my mind. Maybe I can say no. Maybe I don't have to keep doing this. But fear gnawed at me immediately after. What if saying no meant being completely alone? What if this painful relationship was better than no relationship at all? What if I was overreacting, being too sensitive, expecting too much from a grown man with his own life to live? The need for dignity wrestled with my terror of abandonment. I packed away our photos, layering them carefully in an old shoebox, and walked to my bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was someone I barely recognized. Gray hair pulled into a tired bun, eyes rimmed with worry lines, shoulders curved inward as if I was trying to make myself smaller. I was still me, but I wasn't the same person who'd raised David with such hope and love. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost myself in the endless cycle of giving. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called David myself, instead of waiting for him to call me. My heart hammered against my ribs as the phone rang. "Yeah, Mom, what's up?" he answered, distracted. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, the words feeling strange and powerful in my mouth. There was a pause. Then his voice came back sharp and dismissive. "Can't keep doing what? Being dramatic? I could hear him talking to someone else in the background, barely paying attention to our conversation. David, I found the receipts, the bills, the loans you took out under my name. His silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold as winter rain. You're just old and tired, Mom. You don't understand how finances work anymore. The line went dead. I sat staring at my phone, a mix of rage and heartbreak swirling in my chest. He'd hung up on me. After everything I'd sacrificed, after all the years of putting his needs before my own basic dignity, he'd hung up on me for asking a simple question about my own financial security. 2 days later, my daughter Lisa called. I thought maybe David had told her about our conversation. Maybe she was calling to offer support, or at least to hear my side of the story. Instead, she launched into a lecture about family loyalty and how I was being too sensitive about David's situation. Mom, you know David's going through a tough time right now, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of exasperation that made me feel like a difficult child. He's trying to get his life together, and you're making it harder by questioning every little thing. You're being dramatic. Even my husband Robert, before he passed 2 years ago, had urged me to keep the peace whenever I brought up concerns about David's treatment of me. He's our son, Robert would say, as if that simple fact erased all the hurt and manipulation. Family is family, Eleanor. You don't turn your back on family. But what happens when family turns its back on you first? What happens when the people who are supposed to love you treat you like an inconvenience, a resource to be tapped when needed and ignored when you're not useful? These were questions I'd never dared to ask out loud, not until that day when my teacup shattered on the kitchen floor. I felt like a ghost in my own family, present but not seen, heard but not listened to, loving but not loved in return. Each conversation with David or Lisa left me feeling smaller, more invisible, more convinced that my feelings and needs didn't matter to anyone. But salvation came in a form I never expected. Maria Socorro lived in the apartment next door, a retired teacher from the Bronx who'd moved to the Lower East Side after her husband died. I'd nodded to her in the hallway for 2 years, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, or complained together about the building's temperamental heating system, but I'd never really talked to her, not about anything that mattered. The day after David hung up on me, I was sitting on the front stoop of our building, not really doing anything, just needing to be somewhere other than my apartment with its broken teacup pieces and scattered receipts. Maria came down the stairs with a bag of groceries, took one look at my face, and set her bags down beside me. "Honey, you look like someone stole your last dollar and kicked your dog," she said, her voice warm with a slight accent that reminded me of my own grandmother. "What's got you looking so lost?" I don't know what it was about her tone. Maybe it was the genuine concern. Maybe it was just the relief of being seen as a human being instead of an ATM. But I started crying right there on the stoop. Not quiet tears this time, but the kind of sobbing that comes from years of held-back pain. Maria didn't ask questions. She didn't say I was overreacting or being too sensitive. She just sat beside me, occasionally rubbing my back, letting me cry until the tears ran out. When I could finally speak, she listened without judgment as I told her about David, about the car, about feeling like a stranger in my own family. "That boy needs to learn some respect," she said simply when I finished. "And you need to learn that you deserve it." She brought me hot tea that evening, real tea in a china cup, and we sat in my kitchen talking until past midnight. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not David's mother or Lisa's problem or Robert's widow, but Eleanor. Just Eleanor, with thoughts and feelings and worth that existed independent of what I could provide for other people. Maria became my lifeline over the following weeks. She'd check on me daily, bringing small gifts, a flower from her windowsill, homemade soup when she noticed I was losing weight, helpful articles she'd clipped from newspapers about financial fraud protection. Her consistent kindness was like a fragile thread pulling me back to myself, reminding me that relationships could exist without demands and conditions. Have you ever had someone enter your life at exactly the moment when you needed them most? Someone who saw through all your pain to the person you used to be before life wore you down? That was Maria for me. an unexpected angel in a building full of strangers. One crisp morning in April, Maria suggested we take a walk to a legal aid clinic she'd heard about in Chinatown. "It can't hurt to ask some questions," she said gently, not pushing but making it clear she'd come with me if I wanted the support. The offices were small and bustling, filled with people who looked like they'd been carrying heavy burdens for far too long. A young lawyer named Jennifer sat with us for over an hour, patiently explaining my rights regarding financial identity theft and elder abuse. Words I'd never thought would apply to my situation suddenly made perfect sense of everything I'd been experiencing. "Your son using your personal information to secure loans without your knowledge is identity theft," Jennifer explained, her voice kind but firm. "You have legal options. You also have the right to protect your financial assets from further abuse." For the first time in years, I felt like I had some power in my own life. Jennifer helped me understand how to freeze my credit, how to dispute fraudulent charges, and most importantly, how to say no without guilt or fear. Walking back to my apartment that afternoon, Maria linked her arm through mine and smiled. "How does it feel to know you're not crazy?" she asked. "Terrifying," I admitted, "but also freeing." That evening, when David called with another urgent request for money, something about needing cash to fix his car, I took a deep breath and said something I'd never said before. "No." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the call had dropped again. When David finally spoke, his voice was sharp with disbelief. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I can't give you any more money, David. I need to take care of myself. Are you serious right now? After everything I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, but I felt more alive than I had in years. I'd set a boundary, a real boundary with real consequences, and the world hadn't ended. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up in a panic about bills or David's next crisis. No frantic calls, no borrowed money, no knot of anxiety in my stomach. Just sleep, deep and peaceful and uninterrupted. The next morning, I walked to Chase Bank on Houston Street and opened a new savings account. My own account, with only my name on it, requiring no explanations to anyone about how I chose to spend or save my money. It was a small step, but it felt revolutionary. Over the following weeks, David called several times, his tone cycling through various stages of manipulation. First came the anger. "You're being selfish and unreasonable." Then the guilt. "I can't believe my own mother would abandon me when I need help." Then the false concern. "Are you feeling okay? This isn't like you." Each call was a test of my resolve, and each time I hung up feeling a little bit stronger. I was learning that I could love my son without funding his irresponsibility. I could care about his well-being without sacrificing my own. These were lessons I should have learned decades ago, but better late than never. Maria celebrated each small victory with me. When I successfully disputed my first fraudulent charge, she brought over a bottle of wine and we toasted to my financial independence day. When I went an entire week without returning David's increasingly demanding voicemails, she took me to a matinee movie, the first film I'd seen in a theater since Robert died. But I knew the real test was coming. David wouldn't give up easily, not when his primary source of emergency funding had suddenly dried up. He'd want a family meeting, a chance to explain why I was being unreasonable, an opportunity to manipulate Lisa into pressuring me to change my mind. The call came on a humid Sunday evening in June. Lisa's voice was tight with frustration when she asked if I could come to dinner the following weekend. "David really wants to talk to you, Mom. He thinks there's been some kind of misunderstanding between you two." I almost laughed at the word misunderstanding, as if years of financial and emotional abuse could be chalked up to a simple miscommunication. But I agreed to the dinner. I was ready to face them both, armed with knowledge about my rights and, more importantly, with a newfound understanding of my own worth. The restaurant Lisa chose was a mid-range Italian place in Brooklyn, the kind of family establishment with red checkered tablecloths and photos of Sicily covering the walls. David was already seated when I arrived, dressed nicely for once, his hair recently cut, his smile practiced and charming. He stood to hug me, and for a moment, I felt that old familiar tug of maternal love. "Mom, you look great," he said, pulling out my chair with exaggerated gallantry. "I've missed talking to you." Lisa arrived a few minutes later, kissing my cheek and settling into her seat with obvious tension. "So," she said without preamble, "David explained about the money situation. Mom, I think you might be confused about some things." I let them talk first, David launching into a well-rehearsed explanation about how the loans under my name were actually a favor to me. Something about building my credit score, helping me qualify for better insurance rates. His words washed over me like white noise, familiar patterns of manipulation dressed up in new language. "The thing is, Mom," he continued, reaching across the table to pat my hand, "I've been trying to help you manage your finances because, let's be honest, you're getting to an age where these things get confusing. I was just trying to take some of the burden off your shoulders." Lisa nodded along, her expression suggesting she found this explanation perfectly reasonable. "David's good with money, Mom. Maybe it would be easier if you just let him handle some of these complicated financial decisions for you." I listened to them talk about me like I wasn't there, discussing my mental capacity and decision-making abilities as if I was a child who couldn't be trusted with sharp objects. The familiar shame began to creep up my throat, that old voice telling me maybe they were right, maybe I was being oversensitive, maybe I should just apologize and go back to the way things were. But then I remembered Jennifer's voice at the legal aid clinic. "You have rights. You have options." I remembered Maria's unwavering support. "You deserve respect." Most of all, I remembered that peaceful night's sleep after I'd said no. The first truly restful sleep I'd had in years. I reached into my purse and pulled out an old family photo, one of the few remaining pictures of the four of us together from David's college graduation. In it, we all looked happy, united, proud of each other. I placed it carefully in the center of the table, smoothing out the creases. "Do you remember this day?" I asked quietly. David glanced at the photo and smiled. "Yeah, of course. Great day. I was so proud of you. We all were." I thought about all the sacrifices that led to that moment, the double shifts, the skipped meals, the delayed medical care, and I felt like it had all been worth it because my son was going to build a good life. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, where are you going with this?" I picked up the photo and, looking directly at David, slowly tore it in half. The sound seemed to echo through the restaurant. Other diners glanced over at our table, sensing the tension that had suddenly crystallized in our little corner of the room. "I will no longer buy love," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I will no longer be treated like an ATM instead of a mother. I will no longer allow either of you to gaslight me into thinking that asking for basic respect is confusion, or sensitivity, or mental decline." David's face flushed red. "Mom, you're embarrassing yourself. People are staring. Let them stare. I'm done being ashamed of having feelings and boundaries." Lisa tried a different approach, her voice taking on that coaxing tone she used with her own children. "Mom, we're family. Family means we help each other, even when it's hard. David's going through a rough patch and what about my rough patch?" I interrupted, feeling strength in my voice I hadn't heard in years. "What about the fact that I'm 73 years old, living on a fixed income, worried about my health, and being treated like my only value is what I can provide financially? When does someone help me?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. David's charm had evaporated, replaced by cold anger. "Fine," he said, tossing his napkin on the table. "If that's how you want to be, then that's how we'll be. But don't come crying to us when you're all alone and need something." He stormed out of the restaurant, leaving Lisa and me sitting across from each other with the torn photograph between us. Lisa looked stunned, like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. "Mom, he didn't mean that," she said weakly. "He's just upset. If you just apologize—" "No." I stood up, placing enough money on the table to cover my untouched meal. "I won't be apologizing for standing up for myself. Not to David, not to you, not to anyone." I walked out of that restaurant feeling simultaneously heartbroken and liberated. The family I'd spent my entire adult life serving and protecting was gone, but maybe it had never really existed in the first place. Maybe I'd been clinging to an illusion of love that was really just an arrangement where I gave and they took. The following weeks were a masterclass in family manipulation. David tried every tactic in his arsenal. Angry voicemails about my selfishness, late-night calls where he'd cry about how much he missed me, Messages through Lisa about fabricated emergencies that required immediate financial assistance. He even showed up at my apartment building once, buzzing from downstairs and pleading with me through the intercom to let him come up so we could talk like adults. But I'd learned to recognize these patterns now, thanks to Jennifer at the legal aid clinic and my ongoing conversations with Maria. David wasn't missing me. He was missing my checkbook. His tears weren't about our relationship. They were about the inconvenience of having to fund his lifestyle through other means. Lisa played her part too, calling regularly to express concern about my isolation and remind me that family relationships require compromise and forgiveness. She seemed genuinely confused by my transformation, unable to understand how someone could go from doormat to boundary setter overnight. "This isn't you, Mom," she said during one particularly frustrating phone call. "You've always been the peacekeeper, the one who keeps our family together. Why are you being so stubborn now?" "Maybe," I replied. "The person you thought was me was actually just someone too afraid and too tired to be herself." I'd been free from David's financial demands for almost 3 months when the really nasty stuff started. Maria knocked on my door one morning with a concerned expression and a folded piece of paper. "Honey, I hate to show you this, but I think you need to see what's being said about you." It was a printout of a social media post David had shared with his friends, and apparently some of our mutual acquaintances from the old neighborhood. In it, he painted a picture of a bitter, mentally declining mother who had cut off her own family out of spite and paranoia. He described years of his patient attempts to help me manage my finances, my growing confusion and hostility, his heartbreak over losing the mother he'd always adored. The post was carefully crafted to make him look like a devoted son dealing with a difficult parent, complete with old family photos and comments from people expressing sympathy for his situation. Several people I'd known for years had commented with messages of support for David and concern about my mental state. Reading that post felt like being punched in the stomach. The betrayal was breathtaking in its coldness and calculation. David had taken our private family conflict and weaponized it publicly, creating a narrative where I was the villain in my own story of self-advocacy. My first instinct was to defend myself, to write my own post explaining the real situation, to call these mutual acquaintances and set the record straight, to fight back against his lies with evidence of his financial abuse and manipulation. But then I remembered something Maria had told me weeks earlier. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Let people who want to believe lies believe them. The people whose opinions actually matter will see through the manipulation. So I did something that would have been impossible for the old Eleanor, the people-pleasing doormat who couldn't bear the thought of anyone thinking badly of her. I did nothing. I didn't respond to David's post. I didn't call anyone to explain my side. I didn't defend myself against accusations I knew were false. Instead, I folded the printout carefully and threw it away. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my window, watching the city move and breathe below me. For the first time in my adult life, someone else's opinion of me, even my own son's opinion of me, mattered less than my own knowledge of who I was and what I deserved. That silence, that refusal to engage with his manipulation, was perhaps the strongest thing I'd ever done. It confirmed what I was beginning to understand. My transformation wasn't fragile or temporary. I wasn't the broken mother anymore, constantly seeking approval and love through service and sacrifice. I was a woman who had reclaimed her own worth, her own voice, her own right to respectful treatment. Friends from the old neighborhood did call over the following weeks, some with genuine concern, others clearly fishing for gossip. I kept my responses simple. "David and I are having some difficulties right now. I'm doing well, thank you for asking." I didn't elaborate, didn't justify, didn't explain. The people who truly cared about me, like Maria, didn't need explanations. The people who only wanted drama weren't worth my energy. Summer arrived early that year, painting the city in shades of green and gold that reminded me how beautiful life could be when you weren't constantly weighted down by other people's problems. One morning in June, while walking past a community center in Williamsburg, I noticed a sign advertising art classes for seniors. I hadn't picked up a paintbrush since high school, hadn't even thought about creativity or personal expression in decades. My entire adult life had been about practical concerns, paying bills, raising children, managing household crises. But something about that sign called to me, whispered promises of colors and possibilities I'd forgotten I was allowed to want. The first day of class, I sat in a room full of strangers holding a palette of acrylic paints, feeling nervous and excited in equal measure. Our instructor, a patient woman named Carmen with paint-stained fingers and a contagious laugh, encouraged us to start with whatever moved us, whatever we felt like exploring. I painted my apartment window, not as it was, cramped and overlooking a busy street, but as I wished it could be, wide and bright, looking out onto gardens and sky, with flowers blooming on the windowsill and sunlight streaming across the glass, colors splattered on canvas like my new life, messy, imperfect, but entirely mine. Week after week, I returned to that class, each painting becoming a small act of self-discovery. I painted memories from my childhood, dreams I'd abandoned decades ago, feelings I'd never been able to put into words. The other students became a new kind of family, people who celebrated each other's small victories and offered encouragement without expecting anything in return. Maria often picked me up after class, marveling at each new painting I brought home. "Look at you, Picasso," she'd tease, helping me find wall space to display my growing collection. "Who knew you had all this beauty hiding inside?" Through the community center, I also started volunteering with a support group for elder abuse survivors. It was heartbreaking and healing in equal measure, meeting other people who'd experienced financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and family betrayal. Many of their stories echoed my own. Adult children who viewed aging parents as resources rather than people, family members who used guilt and supposed love to maintain systems of abuse. As a volunteer, I helped newcomers understand their legal rights, navigate social services, and most importantly, recognize that they deserved better treatment regardless of their age or family relationships. Every person I helped felt like a small victory over the voice in my head that had spent years telling me I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult. My apartment began to transform too. The old family photos came down, replaced by my own artwork and plants that thrived in the southern exposure I'd never fully appreciated before. I bought new curtains, bright yellow instead of the faded brown ones that had hung there since Robert died, and they fluttered cheerfully over windows I now kept open most days. The difference wasn't just visual. The entire atmosphere of my home changed from a place where I waited for other people to need me, to a space where I lived fully in my own right. When Maria visited now, which she did regularly, I offered coffee not in a rush between crises but with genuine warmth and presence, actually enjoying our conversations instead of anxiously checking my phone for David's next emergency. I started reading again, novels I chose for pure enjoyment rather than self-help books about managing difficult family relationships. I took myself to matinee movies, explored neighborhoods I'd never had time to visit when my life revolved around other people's schedules. Small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary after decades of self-sacrifice. Did I miss David? Of course I did, but I missed the son I thought I had, not the man who'd been using and manipulating me for years. I mourned the relationship that had never really existed, and I grieved for the mother I'd been, well-intentioned but enabling, loving but not wise, generous but not self-protective. The hardest part wasn't his absence. It was learning to live with myself as the center of my own life. After decades of defining myself through service to others, figuring out who Eleanor was when she wasn't David's mother or Robert's wife or Lisa's problem felt like learning to walk again. But slowly, gently, with Maria's friendship and Carmen's art classes and the community I'd found through volunteering, I began to remember who I'd been before life wore me down. Not the girl I was at 20, but the woman I was meant to become, strong enough to stand alone, wise enough to recognize manipulation, worthy enough to demand respect. By autumn, 6 months after that dinner in the Italian restaurant, I barely recognized the woman who'd handed over car keys while her son declared his freedom from her. I'd found my own freedom, from anxiety, from manipulation, from the exhausting cycle of giving without receiving anything meaningful in return. One evening in October, while the city sparkled with early fall light, I sat by my window with a glass of wine and watched people hurrying along the sidewalk below. Couples walking hand in hand, families with strollers, teenagers laughing together, all the connections I'd once thought I needed to feel complete. But sitting there in my bright, comfortable apartment, surrounded by paintings I'd created and books I'd chosen and the peaceful silence I'd learned to cherish, I realized something profound. I wasn't lonely anymore. For the first time in my adult life, I was alone without being lonely, independent without being isolated. The painful memories of David's betrayal and Lisa's dismissal were no longer chains binding me to the past. They'd become mile markers on the path I'd walked to find myself, proof that I could survive the worst kind of family betrayal and emerge stronger, clearer, more authentically myself. I'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just a transaction where one person gives and another person takes. I'd learned that family relationships, like all relationships, require mutual care and consideration to be healthy. Most importantly, I'd learned that my own opinion of myself mattered more than anyone else's opinion of me, including my children's. Those lessons hadn't come easily. There were nights I'd cried myself to sleep, days I'd questioned whether standing up for myself was worth the cost, moments I'd almost called David to apologize and beg him to come back into my life on his terms. But each time I'd wavered, Maria had been there to remind me of my worth, or Carmen had helped me paint my feelings into something beautiful, or another abuse survivor had thanked me for helping them find their own strength. The support system I'd built wasn't based on blood relation or legal obligation. It was built on genuine affection, mutual respect, and the choice to show up for each other without conditions or expectations. These people cared about my well-being not because they were required to, but because they wanted to. What a revolutionary concept that had been for someone who'd spent decades believing love had to be earned through service and sacrifice. As winter approached, I found myself planning things I'd never dared to plan before. A trip to visit my sister in California, painting classes I wanted to take, volunteer work I actually had time for now that my schedule wasn't dictated by other people's crises. I was making decisions based on my own interests and needs, a luxury I hadn't experienced since my 20s. Did David ever try to reconnect? Occasionally. Usually around holidays or when he was facing a particularly expensive emergency. The messages followed predictable patterns: guilt about our misunderstanding, promises to do better, subtle implications that his financial stability depended on my support. But the old hooks no longer caught. I'd learned to read between the lines, to see manipulation for what it was rather than mistaking it for love. I responded to these attempts with brief, polite messages. "I hope you're well, David. I'm doing fine." But I no longer felt compelled to fix his problems or fund his lifestyle. His choices were his responsibility, just as mine were mine. It was a boundary that had taken me 73 years to learn, but better late than never. Lisa continued to pressure me occasionally, usually with calls urging me to be the bigger person and make the first move toward reconciliation. Her inability to understand why I wouldn't return to being David's personal bank account frustrated her, I think. She genuinely seemed to believe that asking for respect was the same as being vindictive, but I'd stopped trying to convince anyone that I deserved basic human dignity. The people who couldn't see my worth weren't my responsibility to educate. My energy was better spent nurturing relationships with people who valued me as a person rather than tolerated me as a resource. Spring came again, marking a full year since my transformation had begun. I celebrated privately, taking myself out to dinner at a nice restaurant. Not because it was a special occasion, but because I wanted to and I could. Such a simple pleasure, dining alone without apologizing to anyone for taking up a table, ordering exactly what I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences. At the restaurant, I raised my water glass in a private toast to the woman I'd become, to the boundaries I'd learned to set, to the peace I'd found in my own company. The elderly couple at the next table smiled at me, probably recognizing something familiar in the quiet contentment I radiated. "You look happy," the woman commented as they were leaving. "I am," I replied, and meant it completely. That simple exchange captured everything I'd learned. Happiness wasn't something other people could give me or take away. It wasn't dependent on my children's approval or contingent on their presence in my life. It was something I could create for myself through self-respect, healthy boundaries, and the courage to live authentically. Now, As I sit here almost 2 years after that day I gave David the car keys, I can see my entire story with clarity I never had while I was living it. The suffering wasn't meaningless. It taught me things about myself and about love that I couldn't have learned any other way. The betrayal was real, and it hurt, but it also freed me from an illusion that was slowly destroying my sense of self. I learned that being a good mother doesn't mean being a doormat. I learned that loving someone doesn't require funding their poor choices. I learned that family members who truly care about you will respect your boundaries rather than punish you for having them. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your own life. 73 years old felt ancient when I was trapped in cycles of giving without receiving, but it feels quite young when you're finally free to live according to your own values and desires. The city outside my window hasn't changed much, but my relationship to it has transformed completely. Those same streets that once felt like a maze of obligations and emergencies now represent possibilities and adventures. The same apartment that once felt like a prison of worry now feels like a sanctuary of peace. I think about that woman who handed over expensive car keys while her son talked about being free, and I feel profound compassion for her. She was doing the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. She believed love meant sacrifice, that motherhood meant endless giving, that family meant accepting whatever treatment was offered without complaint. She wasn't wrong to love deeply or to want the best for her child. She was wrong to believe she had to earn love through service, to accept disrespect as the price of relationship, to sacrifice her own well-being for someone who didn't value it. The transformation from that woman to who I am now wasn't easy or quick. It required facing fears I'd carried for decades, challenging beliefs that had shaped my entire adult life, learning skills I'd never needed when I was focused on everyone else's needs. But every difficult step was worth it for the peace I've found on the other side. Do I have regrets? Of course. I regret not learning these lessons sooner, not setting boundaries when David was younger, not recognizing manipulation before it became a way of life. I regret the years I spent convinced that my feelings didn't matter as much as other people's comfort. The opportunities I missed because I was always dealing with someone else's crisis. But I don't regret the journey that brought me here. Every painful experience taught me something valuable about love, respect, and the difference between the two. Every betrayal revealed something important about the people in my life and the dynamics I'd been enabling. Every moment of standing up for myself built strength I didn't know I possessed. The sunset is painting my apartment walls golden as I reflect on all of this. Wine glass in hand, cat purring contentedly in my lap. Yes, I finally got the pet I'd always wanted but never had time for when my life belonged to other people. The peace I feel isn't the peace of resignation or defeat. It's the peace of someone who has fought for herself and won. Tomorrow, Maria and I are taking the subway to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, something I've been meaning to do for years, but never had time for. Next month, I'm starting an intermediate painting class and planning that trip to California. These aren't grand adventures, but they're mine, chosen freely without having to consider anyone else's needs or schedule. I've learned to cherish the small freedoms, sleeping through the night without anxiety, making plans without worrying about emergency calls, spending my own money on things that bring me joy rather than solving other people's problems. These might seem like basic rights to some people, but they feel like miracles to someone who spent decades believing she didn't deserve them. The relationship with David remains non-existent, and I've made peace with that reality. Lisa calls occasionally, still hoping I'll come to my senses and resume my old role as family bank and problem solver. But her calls don't carry the same power to upset me they once did. I listen politely, offer appropriate responses, and continue living according to my own values rather than her expectations. Some people might see this as a sad ending, a mother estranged from her children, growing old alone. But I see it as a beginning, the first chapter of a life lived intentionally, with dignity and self-respect as the foundation for every decision. The family I've built now consists of people who chose to be in my life because they enjoy my company, not because they need something from me. Maria, Carmen, the friends I've made through volunteering, the neighbors who check on me because they care. These relationships nourish my soul in ways that obligation-based family connections never could. I think often about other people who might be living the story I used to live, giving endlessly to family members who take without gratitude, sacrificing their own well-being for people who don't reciprocate, staying silent about mistreatment because they fear abandonment more than they value respect. To those people, I want to say, you deserve more. You deserve to be treated with kindness and consideration. You deserve to have your feelings acknowledged and your boundaries respected. You deserve relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided obligation. It's never too late to reclaim your own life, to stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the full meal of respectful treatment. The people who truly love you will rise to meet your new standards. The people who don't weren't really loving you anyway. They were just using you. The fear of being alone is real and powerful. But I can tell you from experience that being alone with dignity feels infinitely better than being surrounded by people who don't value you. Loneliness is temporary and fixable by finding genuine connections. Self-betrayal is corrosive and only gets worse the longer you accept it. Learning to love yourself enough to demand respectful treatment is the most important skill anyone can develop, whether you're 23 or 73. It's never too early to start setting boundaries, and it's never too late to stop accepting less than you deserve. As the light fades and the city settles into evening, I feel nothing but gratitude for the journey that brought me here. Every painful step was necessary to reach this place of peace and self-acceptance. Every betrayal revealed truth I needed to see. Every moment of standing up for myself built the strength I now carry with quiet confidence. The woman who gave her son an $80,000 car while he declared his freedom has found her own freedom. Freedom from manipulation, from guilt, from the exhausting cycle of loving people who don't love her back. It's a different kind of freedom than David meant when he spoke those cutting words, but it's infinitely more valuable. This is what liberation looks like after decades of servitude. This is what peace feels like after years of anxiety. This is what self-love looks like after a lifetime of self-sacrifice. And it's never, ever too late to begin. But let me tell you about what happened 6 months ago, because the story doesn't end where I thought it would. Sometimes life has its own plans for the lessons we need to learn, and sometimes those lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. I was walking home from my Thursday morning painting class, carrying a canvas still wet with oils, a landscape I'd painted from memory of the farm where I'd grown up in upstate New York, before I met Robert, before I became a mother, before I learned to define myself through other people's needs. The autumn day was crisp, with that particular New York energy that makes you feel like anything is possible. As I turned the corner onto my street, I saw him leaning against the brick wall of my building. David. But not the David I remembered from our confrontation at the restaurant, or the angry voice on the other end of phone calls demanding money. This was a David I hadn't seen in years. Thin, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. He was staring at his hands, and when he looked up at me, there was something broken in his expression that stopped me cold. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. I stood there holding my painting, feeling all the strength I'd built over the past year and a half war with something deeper. Not the old urge to fix his problems, but genuine human compassion for someone who was clearly suffering. "David," I said carefully, "what are you doing here?" He pushed himself off the wall, swaying slightly, and I realized he might be sick. Really sick. His skin had a grayish tinge I'd never seen before, and his eyes were sunken in their sockets. "I know you don't want to see me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve. I know I fucked everything up." The profanity sounded strange coming from him, like he was trying to shock himself into honesty. "But I need to tell you something, and then I'll go away if that's what you want." A part of me wanted to walk past him, to maintain the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish. Another part of me, the part that had spent 45 years being his mother, couldn't ignore the fact that my son was standing in front of me looking like he might collapse at any moment. "Are you using drugs, David?" I asked bluntly. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wish it was that simple." "No, Mom. I'm not using drugs. I'm dying." The words hit me like a physical blow. The painting slipped from my hands and clattered to the sidewalk, oils smearing across the concrete in abstract patterns that would have been beautiful if my world wasn't suddenly tilting off its axis. "What do you mean?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Liver disease. Apparently, all those years of drinking away my problems caught up with me. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, possibly less." He looked down at the ruined painting. "I'm sorry. That was probably something you were proud of." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. My son, my manipulative, selfish, often cruel son, was telling me he was dying, and my first thought wasn't about the painting or even about our complicated history. My first thought was a simple, devastating truth. I wasn't ready to lose him. Not like this. Not with so much left unresolved between us. "Come upstairs," I heard myself saying. "We need to talk." He followed me into the building, moving slowly up the stairs I'd climbed thousands of times. In my apartment, he looked around at the paintings covering the walls, the bright yellow curtains, the plants thriving in the sunlight. It was like he was seeing the space for the first time, even though he'd been there countless times before. "It's different," he said, settling carefully into my armchair, the same faded floral one where I'd spent so many nights worrying about him. But somehow it looked different now, too, less like a throne of anxiety, and more like simply furniture. "I'm different," I replied, making tea for both of us with hands that weren't entirely steady. We sat in silence for a while, the afternoon light streaming through those yellow curtains and painting everything in warm gold. Finally, David spoke. "I came here to apologize," he said. "Not because I want money or help or anything from you. I know I'm beyond all that now. I came because I spent the last 3 months in the hospital thinking about my life, about the kind of person I've been, about what I did to you." I sipped my tea and waited. The old Eleanor would have jumped in immediately, offering comfort and forgiveness before he'd even finished speaking. This Eleanor had learned the value of letting people finish their thoughts, especially difficult ones. When I was lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. Like when I was 8 and had pneumonia, and you slept in a chair beside my bed for a week. The nurses kept telling you to go home and rest, and you just refused. You said, "This is where I need to be." He paused, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his worn jacket. "I remember when I was 16 and got arrested for shoplifting. Something stupid, trying to impress some friends. You came to the police station at 3 in the morning, and I expected you to scream at me. Instead, you just hugged me and said, 'We'll figure this out together.' And we did. You made me work at the diner all summer to pay back what I'd stolen, but you never once made me feel like I was a bad person, just someone who'd made a bad choice." The memories he was recounting felt like they belonged to someone else, not because they weren't mine, but because they came from a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. The mother who'd been strong and wise and loving without being desperate or manipulative. "When did I stop being that person to you?" I asked. "When did I become just a resource?" David was quiet for a long time, staring into his teacup like it might hold answers. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "I think it started when Dad got sick," he said. "You were so focused on taking care of him, and then after he died, you were so lost, so desperate to feel needed again. I saw that desperation, and instead of helping you through it, I used it. I let you believe that the only way to keep me in your life was to solve my problems with money. The honesty was brutal and necessary. I felt tears gathering in my own eyes, not just for the relationship we'd destroyed, but for the mother I'd allowed myself to become, needy instead of nurturing, desperate instead of wise. But the thing is, Mom," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "even when I was taking advantage of you, even when I was treating you like shit, treating you badly, I knew what you were really offering. It wasn't the money. It was love. And I threw it away because I was too proud and too screwed up to admit I needed it. I set down my teacup because my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Why are you telling me this now, David? What do you want from me? I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to be the son you deserved all along," he said. "Not because I'm dying and I'm scared, though I am both of those things. Because I finally understand what I lost when I pushed you away, and I understand what you lost when you let me. We talked until the sun set, and the apartment grew dark around us. David told me about the past 18 months since our confrontation at the restaurant, how he'd tried to find other people to manipulate and fund his lifestyle, how those relationships had crumbled quickly when people recognized what he was doing, how he'd eventually had to face the consequences of his own choices, including the drinking that had seemed like a way to avoid feeling guilty about how he treated me. I kept telling myself you were overreacting, he admitted, that you were being dramatic and selfish, but deep down, I knew you were right about everything. I knew I was using you, and I knew it was wrong, and I hated myself for it. I just didn't know how to stop without admitting what I'd become. I told him about the legal aid clinic, about learning that what he'd done had actual names: financial abuse, identity theft, emotional manipulation. I told him about Maria and Carmen and the art classes, about discovering who I was when I wasn't busy being someone's victim. "I'm proud of you," he said when I finished. "I know that probably sounds weird coming from me, but I'm proud that you found the strength to save yourself, even though it meant cutting me out of your life. It nearly killed me to do it," I admitted. "Not because I missed being used, but because I missed the son I thought I had. I missed the relationship I'd convinced myself we had." "We can have a real relationship now," David said. "If you want to. I know it's probably too late, and I know you might not be able to trust me again. But if you're willing to try, I'd like to spend whatever time I have left being honest with you. No more manipulation, no more lies, no more treating you like a bank account." The conversation that followed wasn't easy. We talked about anger and forgiveness, about the difference between loving someone and enabling them, about whether it was possible to build something real on the ruins of what we'd had before. I told him about the boundaries I'd learned to set and why I couldn't go back to being his problem solver, even now. He told me he didn't want me to go back to that person either, that he'd seen finally what it had cost me to love him that way. When he left that evening, he didn't ask for money or a place to stay or help with his medical bills. He asked if he could come back the following week, just to talk, just to spend time with me as a person instead of as a resource. Over the months that followed, we built something I'd never expected to have: a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and honest communication. David came for dinner every Sunday, bringing flowers from the bodega or interesting books he'd found at used bookstores. We talked about everything: his health, my art, memories from his childhood, dreams we'd both given up along the way. He met Maria, who was initially suspicious but gradually warmed to him as she saw how he treated me with the respect I'd been missing for so long. He came to one of my art shows at the community center, standing in front of my paintings and marveling at the woman his mother had become when she was free to be herself. "I wish I'd known this version of you sooner," he said that evening. "You're so much more interesting than the worried, anxious person I remember." "I was worried and anxious because you kept giving me reasons to be," I replied. "When you stopped doing that, I stopped being that person." The honesty in our conversations was sometimes painful, but always clean. We talked about the years of resentment and manipulation without trying to minimize or excuse any of it. David acknowledged the real harm he'd caused, not just the financial stress, but the way he'd made me doubt my own perceptions and needs. I acknowledged my own role in enabling the dynamic, the ways I'd used giving to try to control his love for me. We had our first real fight about 2 months into this new relationship, when David mentioned casually that he'd been sleeping in his car because he couldn't afford his rent anymore. Every instinct I'd developed over decades of motherhood screamed at me to solve this problem immediately, to open my checkbook and fix what was broken. Instead, I took a deep breath and asked what his plan was. "I don't have one yet," he admitted. "I was hoping you might have some ideas that don't involve you giving me money." It was a small moment, but it felt revolutionary. He was asking for advice, not a bailout. He was treating me like someone whose wisdom might be valuable, not someone whose wallet might be available. Together, we researched social services available to people with terminal illnesses. I helped him navigate the bureaucracy of disability applications and medical assistance programs. I offered emotional support and practical advice, but I didn't offer to solve his problem for him. It was the kind of help I should have been giving him all along, empowering rather than enabling. David ended up in a subsidized housing program for people with serious medical conditions. The apartment was small and basic, but it was his. And he was proud of it in a way I'd never seen him be proud of anything I'd simply bought for him. As his health declined over the winter, our visits became more frequent, but also more precious. David was determined to live his remaining time with intention and integrity, making amends not just with me but with other people he'd hurt along the way. He wrote letters to friends he'd borrowed money from and never repaid, worked with a counselor to understand the patterns of behavior that had brought him to this point, even volunteered at a program for people struggling with addiction. "I don't want to die being the kind of person I was," he told me during one of our last conversations. "I want to die being the kind of person you can remember with love instead of anger." He achieved that goal. When David died on a rainy April morning, surrounded by me, Lisa, and the few friends who'd stuck by him through his transformation, I felt grief but not regret. We'd used our time well. We'd said the things that needed saying, forgiven the hurts that could be forgiven, and built something real out of the wreckage of our old relationship. At his funeral, I spoke about both versions of my son, the one who'd caused me so much pain, and the one who'd found his way back to love before the end. I talked about forgiveness not as excusing harmful behavior, but as choosing to let go of anger when someone demonstrates genuine change. I talked about the difference between enabling someone and empowering them to become better. Lisa was initially confused by my grief. "I thought you two weren't speaking," she said after the funeral. "I thought you'd cut him off completely." "I cut off the financial support and the enabling," I corrected. "But when he was ready to have a real relationship, I was open to it." That's the difference between boundaries and walls. In the months since David's death, I've continued the life I built during our estrangement, but with deeper appreciation for the relationships that matter. My friendship with Maria has grown stronger through shared grief and continued support. My art has become more complex and emotionally rich, informed by the full range of human experience I've finally allowed myself to feel. My volunteer work with elder abuse survivors has expanded to include support groups for families trying to rebuild relationships after abuse and addiction. I think about those final months with David often, not as a cautionary tale about waiting too long to reconcile, but as proof that it's possible to love someone without sacrificing yourself. The boundaries I learned to set didn't prevent reconciliation. They made it possible by ensuring that any relationship we rebuilt would be based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. Some people in my support groups struggle with similar situations. Adult children who abuse and exploit them, followed by deathbed reconciliations or promises to change. I always tell them that forgiveness and trust are different things, that you can love someone and still protect yourself from their destructive behavior, that reconciliation is only meaningful when it's based on genuine change rather than desperation or guilt. The hardest lesson I learned through David's illness and death was that love is not the same as rescue. I'd spent decades confusing the two, believing that if I truly loved my children, I would solve every problem and meet every need. What I learned instead is that true love sometimes means stepping back and allowing someone to face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful to watch. David's transformation in his final months wasn't guaranteed or inevitable. It happened because he chose to take responsibility for his actions and work actively to become better, not because I enabled or rescued him. If I'd continued funding his lifestyle and solving his problems, he might never have hit the bottom that forced him to confront who he'd become. I don't romanticize those last months or pretend they erased years of pain and manipulation. David died as someone I could love and respect, but the journey to get there was costly for both of us. The relationships destroyed, the trust that had to be rebuilt from nothing, the years of anxiety and self-doubt I endured, all of that damage was real and lasting. What I've learned is that some relationships can be healed, but only after they've been fundamentally changed. The mother-son dynamic David and I had before was built on unhealthy patterns that served neither of us well. The relationship we built in his final months was different, based on honesty, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Now, when I sit in my apartment surrounded by paintings and memories, I can hold both truths simultaneously. David caused me tremendous pain, and David found his way back to love before he died. I was a victim of his manipulation, and I was also someone strong enough to save herself when saving became necessary. Our story had a tragic ending, but it also had moments of genuine beauty and redemption. The most important thing I want people to understand is that setting boundaries with family members doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means you love yourself enough to insist on respectful treatment, and sometimes that insistence is exactly what someone needs to recognize how destructive their behavior has become. If David hadn't gotten sick, I don't know if he ever would have approached me with genuine remorse and a desire to change. I might have spent the rest of my life maintaining my boundaries and living peacefully without him, and that would have been a valid outcome too. The healing that happened between us was a gift, not a guarantee, and it was only possible because I'd learned to value my own well-being enough to refuse to be treated badly. Tonight, as I write these final thoughts, I'm preparing for another transition. At 75, I've decided it's time to move out of the city. The Lower East Side apartment that was once a prison of worry and then became a sanctuary of peace now feels too small for the life I want to live in my remaining years. I'm moving to a small town in Vermont, where I've bought a cottage with enough space for a proper art studio and a garden. Maria is moving with me. We've become family in the truest sense, choosing each other not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and companionship. Lisa has finally begun to understand the difference between the boundaries I set with David and rejection of family altogether. She visits more often now, and our relationship has improved dramatically since I stopped being available as her brother's enabler. Without David's chaos consuming all the oxygen in our family dynamic, Lisa and I have been able to connect as adults who choose to enjoy each other's company. The cottage in Vermont has a large front window where I plan to set up my easel, looking out onto mountains and trees instead of city streets. There's a spare room for visitors, a kitchen big enough for cooking meals I actually want to eat, and most importantly, space designed around my own needs and desires rather than someone else's emergencies. I'm not moving to Vermont to escape or hide from the world. I'm moving because I've learned that I deserve to live in a place that feeds my soul, surrounded by beauty and peace I've chosen for myself. It's a decision based on self-love rather than self-sacrifice, and it feels revolutionary even now. As I pack my belongings, including dozens of paintings that document my journey from victim to survivor to fully realized person, I find myself grateful for every difficult step that brought me here. The pain taught me strength. The betrayal taught me discernment. The loneliness taught me self-reliance. The boundaries taught me freedom. Most of all, I learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to insist on your own worth, to walk away from relationships that diminish you rather than enhance you. Whether you're 23 or 73 or somewhere in between, you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You deserve relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided obligation. The woman who handed over car keys while her son declared his freedom found a freedom more profound than anything he could have imagined. It's the freedom that comes from knowing your own worth, setting your own boundaries, and refusing to accept less than you deserve from anyone, including family. This is what redemption looks like. Not a perfect Hollywood ending, but a real life lived with intention, dignity, and love. A life where pain becomes wisdom, where boundaries become freedom, and where the courage to save yourself becomes the foundation for every good thing that follows. Have you ever lived something like this? Or have you known someone who experienced similar family manipulation and financial abuse? Have you ever found yourself giving everything to people who seem to value you only for what you could provide? Please share your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who needs to hear this message, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these stories that so many of us carry in silence. Together, we can remind each other that we all deserve love built on respect, relationships based on mutual care, and the courage to reclaim our own worth no matter how old we are or how long we've been accepting less than we deserve.